All right. If we can, everybody can find a seat, we'll get this meeting started. First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. I know that this has been a long, tedious process, and I want to thank everybody for their patience with PID through this process and the understanding that this is not an easy process for us to go through, but it's also not an easy process, we understand, for you guys to go through too. You have a very dedicated, hardworking team that is working tirelessly to try to solve this problem to make sure that we can get you, the public, back into safe drinking water as quickly as possible. I want to make a few introductions and just let everybody know who's on the stage. We have Sammy Cater from Waterworks Engineering. He's going to be doing the bulk of the heavy lifting tonight with the presentation. Michael Lindquist, he's also with Waterworks Engineer, has been doing a lot of the field work, working in the trenches right next to our guys out on the streets. Bill Taylor, Distribution Superintendent. Jim Ladrini, Distribution Superintendent. We have Mark Sulik, sorry. Mark Sulik, our board president. Uh-oh. So through this process, we have been doing a lot of work behind the scenes to come up with some decisions that have been made that are going to make this system recover much quicker and more efficient. And through our hard work and taking multiple samples, looking at it, looking at the system as a whole, we've come to some conclusions that are going to better the community and better the rebuild of this community, and that's what you'll hear tonight. So to present the water system recovery update, I'm going to introduce Sammy Cater.
Thank you. So like Kevin said, my name is Sammy Cater. I'm with Waterworks Engineers. We've been working with district staff for the last couple of months. See a lot of familiar faces in the crowd. The last time we got together here was about 7 weeks ago. I'm going to try to get this to point right at me instead of over me. So at that time, we knew we had a problem with VOC contamination. We said we were developing a plan. We said the plan could take up to 3 years to execute until 2022. There were some groans. We said we would work on optimizing our approach to try to make that go quicker because we understand the importance of water to this community at this time. So since then, a detailed recovery plan was developed and delivered in mid-April, and initial implementation of that recovery plan has begun. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about the recovery plan. We're going to talk about the initial implementation and what we found and what that means. Before I go any further, I want to just take a brief second to talk about interim water supply. So some people here are here because you have a house that didn't burn in the fire and you're looking at what's going to take to restore potable service to that house. Some people are here who have a burned lot. If you have a burned lot and you are interested in getting interim water supply, so water supply restored to the lot for irrigation purposes, for construction water purposes, for any purpose, there has been a system put in place for you to do that. It's a 4-step process. You make a request to PID, either by phone or in person, to have water reactivated on your lot. Pay the fee. PID will schedule the installation of a backflow preventer. That's what the fee is for the materials and labor of installing that backflow preventer. That's all it's for. And then once the install is complete, then water use can begin under the current use advisory for the whole system. And still only the readiness to serve fee will apply. There will be no demand charge for interim water. So if you have questions about that, you can talk to the folks at the district office, but there is a system in place if you have a lot that you're trying to serve with water for irrigation or construction purposes, or like I said, any purpose. In April, on the PID board meeting on April 17th, which I know a few of you at least were at, and probably many of you were there, we presented a draft of the water system recovery plan. It's a draft. oftentimes the work that we do, we go through a lot of effort to finalize documents before they're presented to the public. This is a bit of a unique situation because we want to move the process forward as quickly as possible, so a draft plan was presented. It included 5 major components: temporary water supply, preparation of sample sites, sampling, replacement of damaged infrastructure, and return to potable service. It's a draft, it's a living document, so as we learn more, we make adjustments. And we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, and we're going to probably talk about that every time we get together, about the adjustments we're making and why we're making them. Just a quick snippet from the recovery plan. There's over 1 million feet of water main in this system that have to be addressed, 10,500 service laterals, approximately 1,400 standing structures that are in the city. The plan includes a plan for prioritizing the work so that we get to the standing structures as soon as we can. The map that's on there is a map of how we were prioritizing per the plan. And with that prioritization, the plan that we presented in April accelerated the schedule significantly from completion by 2022 to serving all of the standing structures by the middle to the end of 2020, and then restoring the entire system by 2021. So we made some progress with the plan. That's a very detailed document. The board meeting was, of course, recorded, so if you want to go online and listen to me talk for an hour and a half about the plan, you're welcome to do that. It's super exciting. Or if you'd like to review the document, it's, of course, available on PID's website. So this is a very technical problem, and everybody here is becoming experts in water systems, whether they like it or not, because you're having to ingest all of this information and try to make decisions for yourself. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some terminology before we go forward, just so that we're all sort of on the same page. And it's things that, as water professionals, we're all very familiar with, but there's no reason why you should be as a general public until now you get to join us in our little lingo world. So, infrastructure. Paradise Irrigation District owns water infrastructure, the distribution system. It generally consists of mains, which are the big pipes under the streets, service laterals, which are small pipes, generally 3/4 inch, sometimes a little bit bigger, that run from the main to your meter, and then the meter. And that makes up the distribution system. And that's what we're talking about tonight, are those components. The mains, the laterals, up to the meter. Next slide. Another couple of terms that are, I think, probably quite familiar to a lot of people in the room are MCLs and PPBs. So MCLs are maximum contaminant limits. They're set by the EPA and by Cal EPA. For benzene, for example, which is, of course, one of the things we're quite concerned about here, the California MCL is 1 part per billion. The federal MCL is 5 parts per billion. Those limits are set on the basis of, for benzene specifically and for other VOCs, chronic exposure, meaning long-term exposure. The standard is 70 years of drinking water at a rate of 2 liters per day, and what impact that could have on health. And in the case of benzene and VOCs, the primary concern is the potential for increased cancer risk at that level of exposure. To give you an idea of what a part per billion is, it's a few drops in a pool the size of the public pool here in town. That's about what a part per billion is. Okay, so far tonight, we talked about the recovery plan being drafted, interim water supply available to customers, and that we've begun the implementation of the recovery plan. So what we're going to talk about next is the data that we've gotten from the sampling that's been done so far. So we're going to talk a little bit about data and statistics, and hopefully I can walk through this where it's clear to everybody. So since we last met, PID staff have applied intense efforts in working the recovery plan and taking the steps that were laid out in that plan and discussed during the board meeting back in April. They've been assisted with mutual aid, which is other water utilities helping during times of need. So specifically, East Bay Municipal Utilities District had a crew of water professionals here this last 2 weeks. There were about 6 of them. In June, San Francisco Public Utility Commission personnel will be here, about 14 of them, to assist in the work to prepare and sample sites and execute the plan going forward. In early May, that team was able to prepare and sample sites at a rate of about 20 locations per day. So we have a protocol that's outlined in the plan, in the recovery plan, and further detailed as we've gone forward on how to sample a home or any standing structure, whether it's a home or business or public structure. And this graphic I'll walk through to talk about what we do to sample a standing structure, and then we'll also have a short video where we'll demonstrate what that looks like. The gold standard in sampling a service lateral to test for VOCs is to allow the service lateral to stagnate for 72 hours and allow any of the VOCs that might be entrapped in the plastic or whatever material that service lateral is made out of to desorb from the walls of the pipe and enter into the water so that we can sample and test them. So this has been discussed through a lot of different people from a lot of different organizations with a lot of experience and scientific background, but we came to the conclusion that the 72-hour soak was the gold standard for testing for benzene and for other VOCs. So when we approach a standing structure, we have to figure out a way to have that service stagnant for 72 hours. Now, in some cases, the structure can have a water outage for enough time for us to get that window of 72 hours. So usually that's 4 or 5 days. So that might be that no one's living there, or the people living there have an option of leaving for a time period. So if that's the case, then we arrange for the pipe to be stagnated, ensure that it is stagnated, and then once it's soaked for 72 hours, take a sample from the lateral, and then run the water a little bit so we're getting water from the main, and we take a sample from the main. So that's starting from box 1. If the homeowner agrees that a 5-day water outage is possible, that's a yes. We move down to box 6. We install a sample manifold. After that's sat for 72 hours, we move on to box 5 there, take the sample. There are, of course, many of you who are living in structures standing here in Paradise, and a 5-day water outage is not practical for sanitation reasons, for whatever reasons. So in order to accommodate that, we follow the other pathway around this graphic, which is we approach a homeowner, a 5-day outage is not practical, then we go to adjacent services, and this could be an adjacent home that's been burned down. It could be an adjacent fire hydrant. We find a location nearby that we can stagnate and test and confirm that it meets all standards. And once we know that that water meets all standards, then we use a hose and hose over. So now we're in box 3, hose over from that adjacent service to the home that's being tested so that they have a continuous supply of water. Then after that's all set up and water is continuing to be supplied to that home, we install a sample manifold at the home or at the business, at the location being sampled, and we let that soak for 72 hours, and we're back into box 5 there, and we take our sample. So that's the explanation with words and pictures, and now we're going to go ahead and move on to a video. So We worked with our partners at Cal OES. They're here somewhere. These guys back here, the Cal OES film crew, and produced a video to explain how this works out in the dirt. And we're going to go ahead and play that, and I'm going to sit down for just a minute.
And I think a piece of 3/8 rebar.
The Paradise Irrigation District, with the help of our colleagues at Waterworks Engineering, based in Reading, are undertaking the unprecedented task of repairing our entire water system in a way that enables us to address our two most critical needs simultaneously. By targeting the areas with the highest concentration of undamaged occupied structures, we at PID are getting potable water fastest to those customers. At the same time, we are actively identifying and performing immediately, when possible, the repairs essential to recovering the larger water system. Once an undamaged home is identified for testing of its water service line, PID's focus shifts immediately to an adjacent destroyed property where we attach a sampling manifold to its meter service line. Performing the test at the unoccupied property prevents the neighbor's occupant's service from being disrupted during the 3-day wait period before the sample test can be drawn. Waterworks engineer Michael Lindquist explains.
The sample manifold allows us to take a water quality sample from the service lateral pipe from here to the street. We take that sample after the water stagnated for 72 hours, which gives ample time for any contaminants that are absorbed into the pipe to leach back into the water in the service lateral. From the same location, we can also sample the water quality in the main pipe by flushing all of the water out of the service lateral and taking a second sample, which represents the water out in the main pipe.
At each location, we're going to take 2 samples. One's from the service lateral, the other's from the main. This first sample is from the service lateral.
Second draw, we got main water now.
Hey, Jim.
Michael.
The test results came back for this service lateral, and they're non-detect.
Outstanding.
So we have no contamination in this service lateral. So what might be the next step that you're going to do here?
So that's good news. So now we are looking at having to sample a standing structure. And in order to sample the standing structure, we need to be able to isolate that standing structure. In order to isolate that standing structure for the stagnation period, we need to provide them with water because we do not want customers to be without water at any time. So we will actually utilize this now that it's come back non-detect as the supply service line for the standing structure, and we'll be able to utilize a hose going from this apparatus to their service line, to the customer side service line on the standing structure. We'll give them water, and we will set up this same apparatus on their service line, and we will sample them in the same manner that we sampled this service line.
But what happens when the sample results for our customer service line comes back showing the presence of contaminants? We have a plan for that too.
So Jim, the test results for this particular service lateral showed a contaminant level above the MCL. What are the next steps that are going to occur to this service lateral?
One of the first things that we want to do whenever we encounter any kind of contamination is to limit that and isolate that particular portion of where we found that contaminant. So the method for doing that is to actually excavate in the street at the water main. We will actually isolate at the corporation stop, the valve that we will use to shut off to now isolate that service line from the water main.
Overall, our plan puts you, the customer, first. We're getting potable water to Paradise's surviving homes and businesses as quickly as possible while avoiding the inconvenience of a customer being without water service during the necessary 3-day stagnation period. Although this plan is more efficient because it uses much fewer resources, the timeline for completion of repairs is extended slightly. The trade-off is that between the tireless work of the contractors and the generous mutual aid, PID personnel can more immediately get back to the business of serving our customers in the way that you were accustomed before the fire.
That's pretty good. All right, so hopefully if you see people from the irrigation district out in the street doing those kinds of things, lugging hoses around, digging around in meter boxes and that kind of stuff, you have a little bit better idea of what they're up to and why they're doing what they're doing and how that helps in the overall process of moving forward with testing and getting results so we can make some decisions. So, testing has begun. There's been over 800 tests taken so far, samples taken. 635 of those samples have gone through and been analyzed, and we have lab results back. Of those 635 samples, 394 of them are service laterals, and 107 are water mains. To give you an idea of the amount of data we have so far. Sampling and analysis is, of course, ongoing. So those 501 locations sampled, if we just take and we say, okay, what are the simple statistics here of those 501 sample locations? 207 of them had a detect for a VOC, a regulated VOC. 109 of those were over the MCL. So 41% of the samples had a detect, 22% of them were over the MCL. You can get this on the website later too. We'll post the whole presentation if you want to look at all the stats. You're more than welcome to take pictures, but I just wanted to share that. That map may be familiar to you if you've been on PID's website. On the Recover page, there is a continuously updated GIS map showing the samples that have been taken and the result of those samples, and you can look at them and click on them and see what they were. What we wanted to do, though, is take this data and look into it a little more deeply. So the first thing we looked at was what kind of locations were those 501 sample locations. And this chart shows 63 of them were residences, or standing structures rather, residences and businesses, 63 standing structures. 331 of them were burned lots that have been sampled. And 107 of the samples were from water mains, from hydrants, from second draws from a lateral into the main, just different ways of sampling the mains. So we looked at all of the data, but now we want to look at the data in each of these three categories. Standing structures, burned structures, and mains. So first we're going to look at just the raw data. So this is the data from standing structures. The vertical axis there is parts per billion, or micrograms per liter, which is the same thing. You might hear people say micrograms per liter. It just means parts per billion. And the horizontal axis is just the number of samples taken. So remember, there were 63. So there's 63 data points on there. And the blue lines, the bottom blue dashed line is the detection limit. Below a half a part per billion, the laboratories can't detect benzene. This is for benzene. The next blue line is the California state MCL, maximum contaminant limit for benzene, which is 1 part per billion. And the next blue dashed line is the federal 5 part per billion MCL. So you can see the data there, and the vast majority of the data was non-detect for benzene. We'll talk a little bit more about those data statistics. This again is from the 62 standing structures that have been sampled. Next slide. Now this is the data from all of the burned lots that have been sampled. And you can see it looks very different, right? Same lines. The axis, the vertical axis is actually different. It runs from 0.1 all the way up to 1,000 parts per billion. Okay, it's what's called a logarithmic scale, just to get it so it would show on a graph. And the lines, the horizontal blue lines are the same, detection limit, MCL, California, and the federal MCL. And you can see there is a lot more data here where we're seeing benzene over the MCL and over the federal MCL even in places where it's a burned lot. Okay? Next slide. Now when we look at the water main data, same type of slide, vertical axis is from 0 to 10 parts per billion, same horizontal lines in blue, and this is about the mains. And the mains aren't quite as good as the laterals that serve standing structures, but still, the data is encouraging, that a majority of the main samples have come back non-detect. So now we're going to do a little bit of statistics on these. I'm going to walk you through this. There's a lot of data here to digest, so I'll talk through what this chart means, and hopefully I can make it clear. So this chart, there's two concentric circles. The inside circle represents detections of any VOC, volatile organic compound, which benzene is the majority of what we're seeing, but it includes any VOC, any regulated VOC. Let me clarify that. The outer ring represents whether that VOC was above the MCL or below the MCL. Okay, so in the inner ring, if it's green, it means there was no VOC detected. If it's red, it means there was a detect. In the outer ring, if it's green, it means the detection, if there was one, was below the MCL, or there was no detect. And if it's red, it means there was a detection that was above the MCL. That's the same for all three charts. The chart on the left is for standing structures. 86% of the standing structures tested non-detect for any regulated VOC. 14% of them tested with a detect. 97% of the standing structures tested under the MCL for all regulated VOCs. Only 2 samples that have been taken so far have measured over the MCL for any regulated VOC in any standing structure. That's good news. In burn structures, it's a bit of a different story. It's a much different story. You remember what the chart looked like, and where we had all that data that was above the MCL. 52% of the samples taken from burned lots, more than half, have tested positive for any regulated VOC. More than half tested positive for any regulated VOC. Of those, only 29% were over the MCL, but still, it's a significant amount of contamination really focused on the burned lots. As far as the water mains go, again, not quite as good as the data that we're seeing coming from the standing structure laterals, but the water mains, 81% of them were non-detect for any regulated VOC. 19% there was some regulated VOC measured. 91% of the tests of mains have come back under all MCLs for regulated VOCs, and only 10 samples of mains have come back with a VOC that was over the MCL. It's a good question. So back to the anatomy of the system, Paradise Irrigation District system just goes to the meter. These samples are being done on the distribution system side of the meter. The meter's being removed. Jim has an example of what a sample manifold looks like. We're installing a sample manifold in place of the meter and taking a sample of the service lateral going to the house. Next slide. Okay, so that was a lot of data pretty quickly. And we've been staring at this for a long time and been neck deep in it. But what does it mean? So the water in the majority of the laterals that serve standing structures, a great majority, has met all of the requirements non-detect for regulated VOCs. Contamination is really focused on the laterals that serve burned lots. The mains, similar to the laterals that serve standing structures, significant proportion of those mains have come back with results that meet all of the requirements for potable water. It might seem intuitive that where there's a burned lot, there's a far higher chance of contamination. And I think until we had this data and we start to see that the data is reflecting what intuition might tell us, there wasn't as much comfort that that is truly the case. But as we start to see this data, more than 500 sample points, and it starts to really underscore what makes sense just from inspection standpoint that a burned lot would be far more likely to be contaminated than a structure that remains standing. It's encouraging. Now, what are the limitations of this data? It's not all non-detect. There was one standing structure that we measured with a MCL violation. There were a few main samples that came back positive for different VOCs. It's not all perfect. No data ever is. It's one sample in time. And while we're happy with the fact that we have taken 500 plus sample locations, 600 plus samples, 800 are in the lab, another 200 are in the lab, and we're starting to amass more data, it's still under 10% of the overall system that's been tested. So there are some limitations to this data. It's encouraging, it's not final. So this brings up a question. If we measure the water going to a standing structure and it's uncontaminated, we've taken a sample of the lateral, a sample of the main, and we've found that it meets all requirements, all MCLs, it's potable water by all standards. Then what? If we haven't tested the other lots around there, the burned lots, and we know that the burned lots seem to have a fairly high propensity for being contaminated, then will those uncontaminated laterals become contaminated by their neighboring laterals? So we have to ask that question. As a community, as a consultant, as a utility, we have to ask that question and sort out what the answer is. Will contaminated laterals cause contamination of uncontaminated laterals? So the first thing we talk about is, so we were doing some math and statistics. Now we're going to do a little chemistry. All right. So the first thing we talk about as a potential way that this could happen is contaminant dispersion. So contaminant dispersion is the movement of contaminants through the water. And so in this case, if all of those adjacent surfaces were contaminated, and then there's clean water running through the main, could that contamination in those adjacent surfaces bleed into that main and cause enough contamination so that the person using the water coming out of that main is exposed to non-potable water, to contaminated water? That's the first question we want to answer. So we looked at dispersion modeling, mathematical modeling of the dispersion behavior of these compounds in water. We used a methodology that was developed by the Division of Drinking Water and adapted it to this particular location. And using that methodology, even if we have all of the adjacent lots at over 100,000 parts per billion, right? The biggest thing we have measured is 900. The worst burned lot so far is 900 and change. I think the worst that they saw in Santa Rosa was something on the order of 40,000, and that was one sample. So we said, okay, what about 100,000? Just the worst thing that's been seen yet. Still, if every adjacent lateral had 100,000 parts per billion, in the entire length of that lateral, and it was leaching into the system, the main water would be non-detect for the mains in this system, per the mathematical modeling. Experts, Division of Drinking Water, the folks over at Purdue, we've had discussions about this to substantiate our calculations that dispersion shouldn't be an issue. They agree with the way we did it. They agree with the conclusion we came to. Next slide. Yeah. All right. Are you a shill? I think he's a shill. All right. Our audience plant. Set up the next slide. So the dilution is the next question. So if we have that same neighborhood, all of those lines are contaminated, and we have a depressurization event, okay? That could be there's a number of things that could cause a depressurization event where the water flows backwards. You lose pressure in your house, the water flows backwards into the distribution system, and it sucks the water out of every one of those contaminated laterals and mixes it all up and then reserves it. In that case, could we have a problem with contamination? And the answer is yes, we could. This is a remaining concern. This would occur during main breaks with significant water loss, or significant local water use, like in a firefighting event. It would be a situation where you would lose all pressure in the house. No water would be coming out of fixtures, which would mean your neighboring lots would have potentially water flowing backwards into the system. So if a main is broken and water's gushing out and it's pulling this contamination in, that could happen. Or if several hydrants are opened at the same time during a firefighting event and the pressure is suddenly dropped in a small zone of the system, then there is the potential that that contamination could move from adjacent lots into the mains. It would be in the mains and then potentially be distributed to people living in those standing structures. So it's a concern, and we'll talk about how we're going to address it. So the original plan, the plan that was presented at the last board meeting, was to test all services and mains before returning any of them to potable service. It's the most conservative plan. It'll take several years to complete. And while it is conservative, there's no such thing as 100% certainty in this world, including that plan or any plan. The current thinking, based on the data we've seen so far, is that once a service is tested and the main is tested in front of that service and those have tested non-detect, we can return that service to potable use. This allows the utility to better support the rebuilding process in terms of schedule. It's supported by mathematical modeling and the real data that we're seeing, but it requires vigilance for times that where contamination could re-enter the system, and communication of ongoing test results to the community. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So under this current thinking from the utility, the conditions for returning a lateral back to potable service are that the lateral and the main test at that lateral are non-detect for VOC. The main in front of so we've got a clean test, and you might even see that on the website, but that's not the end of the decision-making process. We want to look at the hydraulic conditions that exist in the distribution system in front of that location. So the main that's serving that house or that business or that public building, if that main has flow through it, then we feel more confident that the chances for any kind of recontamination are much, much lower. And we use the judgment of the water utility professionals that are here on the stage and others to make the decision about whether to return a service to potability. So it's not just a clean test, it's also some judgment about where that service sits in the distribution system and what the likelihood is that they would get exposed to potentially recontaminated water. Once a service lateral has been determined to be potable, the property owner will be notified in writing from the district. So it'll be very clear that we've looked at test results and that we've looked at where the property sits in the distribution system and made a decision to return that property to potable service. We're not going to ask the public to go look and interpret data for themselves, and if your data looks good on the GIS, then you can feel good about returning to potable use. There'll be a specific letter to each customer. And then ongoing retesting of mains will be done in order to maintain vigilance of water quality in the system. So it's not just going to stop at the one test. There will be continued testing throughout the system to continue to characterize the behavior of the contamination. So there are some possible conditions for rescinding potable service. Just like now, or not now, just like before the fire, there were conditions under which the district rescinded potable service. Certain events would lead to boil notices or other types of communication to the customer base. Now we have an additional concern, which is VOC contamination. So if there is a main break or other depressurization event that we talked about just a few minutes ago, that main will be flushed and disinfected following the main repair, which is already standard operating procedure to avoid bacterial contamination, which is always a concern during a depressurization event. The main will be resampled for VOCs, not just for bacteria, but also resampled for VOCs prior to following the main repair. And then if that sampling shows VOC contamination, that will be communicated to the affected properties, the affected services, and we will let people know there was a depressurization event, there is now contamination in your line. Please return to following the water use advisory that's on the website, and we will work to restore potable service to your property as soon as possible. We'll go out and start working to sort out how to, by either flushing or replacement or repair, return those services to potable service. The other way that there could be a rescinding of potable service is if we see a change in the character of the data. I said, when we talked about data limitations, we have 500 locations, 600 plus data points, 800 samples taken. We're going to start approaching 10% of the system sampled sometime in the next maybe in the next month or two. If we start to get into the next 10% or the next 10% of sampling data, and those charts start looking a lot different than they look now, and we start seeing significant amounts of contamination in services that serve standing structures, or significant amounts of main contamination in certain areas or things like that. We'll communicate that. We'll have another meeting like this. We'll share the data, and we'll talk about what our plan is to deal with that data. So it's not a fire and forget kind of system. Next steps. So we want to sample all of the standing structures and return them to potable service as appropriate as quickly as we can. So that's the first next step. We want to develop a plan for supplying potable water to customers that are moving back to properties where there was a burned structure. So we talked about going and being able to get interim water, but at some point when you're rebuilding or putting on temporary housing, or new customers to PID who are building on a lot that's never been served by PID, we need to be able to provide potable service to those locations as well. One little wrinkle with that is a lot of the rebuilds have fire sprinklers, and so we need to be able to support the fire sprinkler flows with the service lateral that goes to those locations. The next thing we're going to be doing is developing a plan for long-term replacement of all of the contaminated laterals in the system, which will take longer than the original 3 years because we're focused, potentially, because we're focused on returning the standing structures to potable service, supporting rebuilds and move back, and then going through and replacing the laterals in burned lots. So that might stretch out a bit, the replacement of laterals in burned lots that aren't, or previously burned lots that are not occupied. And of course, we've been working with our partners at FEMA and Cal OES to make sure that this can all be funded, because that's important too. And I think that is the last slide. We'll take questions. We don't have, we do have some microphones. So if you have questions, maybe we get a line here and a line there, and then we'll field the questions here on the panel with whoever's the most appropriate. You're first.
work now. Hi. Thank you all for all the work that you are doing, first of all. And I guess my question is, you addressed that the initial modeling work that you had done was reviewed by Purdue, and they had bought into the way that you were, the theory behind it and the calculations you had made. And I just wanted to clarify that all of what you've presented was reviewed by Purdue, and they buy in?
So this presentation was not. We reviewed the dispersion modeling with them last week, but this presentation wasn't ready to be reviewed by them. I'm sure, I imagine Andy might be watching right now. He likes to watch online. I'm sure that they will provide comment to us. If not, we will certainly invite it.
Wonderful, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I live in an area with 20 standing structures, and there's no water there. I was visited by some people that were, I think, setting up the sampling. And so I'd like to get back into that package because I had to leave for 2 weeks. But anyway, two things. I didn't notice any discussion of how the laterals got contaminated. And what you would be doing in the future system to make that not happen, perhaps one-way valves at the distribution side of the meter so that there can't be any backflow past the meter.
Go ahead. I'll start addressing it. If you got more questions.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So as far as how things got contaminated, there are a lot of discussions with a lot of people a lot smarter than me discussing how that may have happened. I think there's going to be research into that for a long time, and a definitive answer of how the contamination occurred is probably not in the time frames we need it to be to act on this project. There's a lot of theories, and I'd be happy to sit down afterwards and talk through them with you. As far as the modifications to PID standards in order to reduce the likelihood of something like this happening again, those are ongoing discussions with this whole group as we look at I think it was the third bullet of supporting rebuilds onto burned lots, and when we're putting in new infrastructure, putting that in a smart way. So yes, that is being considered. We don't have a standard to put up on the screen right now and tell you this is how we're going to do it. That is a combination of both engineering and technical work and funding and financial work that has to be worked through with our partners at FEMA and Cali West.
So if a main or a secondary main is contaminated, how do you purge it?
So the first step would be to try to flush and see if we can get good result from flushing. There are going to be locations where that may not work. In the few places we've had main contamination, there's places where we've seen flushing not be very effective. Those are generally small diameter, dead-end mains with lots of damage around them. And in some of those cases, the only way to fix it is going to be to replace it. So it's going to depend on where it is, how big it is, how bad the contamination is, and so the first try will be flushing, but then eventually it might get to the point where we say that's just a damaged piece of infrastructure, we've got to replace the pipe.
I got one last thing, and that is I couldn't wait 2 or 3 years to get water. So I went to a guy on Pearson Road at Skyway and bought some. I'd like to know where I could get PID potable water to refill my tanks. And I want to make a point that after this is over, the tanks could be used for keeping our trees a little bit greener so they don't burn so easy, and fighting fires. And finally, those tanks would work really well with your purging system, even if somebody needs the water. Once you fill the tank, you don't have to worry about testing theirs and digging up the other one and all that crossover stuff. I used to do things not with water, but with computers and stuff, and this can be sped up, at least from the viewpoint of people who are doing without their water now. If you guys would start filling water tanks for people, and maybe supporting those 5-gallon jugs that are for sale at Save Mart, so people could have drinking water and laundry water while you're doing it right, taking your time, takes the pressure off of you, and it would be good for everybody here to be able to get water in town from PID. I'm willing to pay the reserve meter fee or whatever you said it was, the baseline pay to get water. And why not set up a place right there at the PID office where we could get water?
I'm going to let Jim answer that one.
Thank you, I appreciate that. So one is, first, I would really like to know the area of town you live in. If there's no water there, I need to address that, and quickly, especially if there are that many standing structures there. So we really looked and focused on those areas and the way that we needed to fill our water mains and pressurize. Next is we, through this process.
I already met you at that place.
I'm sorry?
I already met you at my house. You came by to do a questionnaire. But anyway, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So I don't think that was me, but I still need to know because I can make the decisions to get you water there. So what we do have in play now, and we talked about it today, and we've been working on it for quite some time, is where can we provide a source of potable water in town, and we had to be confident that the potable water was there and that we had a way to maintain that and to sample that as we're using that water. And your idea of the PID office is prime. We set up a location there, so we intend within about 2 weeks, I think we'll have a station set up there to provide residential water, potable water to smaller tanks, jugs. We'll have an 1.5-inch outlet and a 3/4-inch hose outlet. So gallons, 5 gallons, 20 gallons, and small trailers could be filled with potable water at that location.
Gracias.
And right, just to be clear, right now you can get it at the water plant, right?
You can fill up your 5-gallon jugs at the water plant for free. There's 2 filling stations there at the water plant.
Is the address and that fact up on your website?
I believe it is. It's off of Pine Needle Drive.
Okay. I'll go there
Right
and
at the
look, and
base
then I'll
of
be there
Magalia Dam.
tomorrow.
Right at the base of Magalia Dam.
I got a couple questions. For fire sprinklers, I was understanding that they have to have a flow for how much water pressure you have in order to design your system. How are we supposed to get said flow if we have no water? Are they going historical flows or?
So there's a number of things that we'll need to do in order to support rebuilds, and the fire calculations being done by the fire sprinkler folks. We're aware of all of them and working on all of them. But the question's a good one. There's a few things that need to be done in order to provide that data. We do have, can you guys all hear me? We do have a functioning water model of the system where we can predict pressures at different locations, and there is also a standard operating procedure for testing the pressure at a service and being able to provide that to the homeowner for the build. So we do have some things in place. We don't have a final sheet of paper to say, hey, if you're rebuilding, here's how it's going to work. We're working on getting that in place, but we are aware of the issues and working on them.
I know they gave a few permits out, so is that something we don't have to have finalized yet before we hand our permits into the city?
I don't know what stage the town is requiring. I don't know what stage of the process the town is requiring the fire sprinkler there. So what we've done thus far is provide a pressure range in the area. So we receive an address. We need a pressure range from here, and we give the fire sprinkler designer that information. It's really, in my opinion, and I think in a lot of others' opinions, that's just not enough information. We're falling back. Finally, we're able to fall back onto our residential fire flow test, that we actually come and test the service line. We give pressure, we give flow in gallons per minute, we give service line size and other material that assists the fire sprinkler designers in their designing of that system. To your direct question, if you don't have water there, we need to look at that. Can we get water there? If we can't, why can't we get water there, and what do we need to do to get water there so that we can get that information for you? So that could be a little stall in the process. In most in areas where there is water, we're pressurized, and we can get to the service line, we can sample, or we can test that service line for fire flow.
We're kind of, I called, talked to somebody at the PID about that. We live off of Sunset and in the cul-de-sac. Apparently they didn't have any easement, and so the water stopped right on Sunset, and we live in the back of the cul-de-sac, and we have to resupply the line all the way down there. So at 1.5 inches, I guess.
So I think I know where you're at, and when you talk about that, there's a bank of 4 meters there, and
Yeah.
you go back to 4 parcels that are on
Right.
that cul-de-sac right there. And so those meter locations will stay the same. In that very location, we have a 4-inch main that comes across there. So there's plenty of water from the PID standpoint and plenty of pressure. So the fire sprinkler designer would look at that and say, here's the information that PID provided, and we'll come down and we'll sample at those service lines.
Okay.
They'll look at that, and then they'll determine what your size your line will be behind that.
Right. Let's say I'm on the west side of the street. Our meter's on the east side of the street. Is there any way of getting that changed so I don't have to run it across? I'm gonna have to run across the asphalt, then 100 yards down to the house at my cost to replace the line and put a backflow meter on it?
We can talk about that, and we will.
I talked about it, and it was a
So,
$26,000 bill on my behalf to get the water line going down the street.
Right.
So that was a little bit steep for
So I think
my taste.
I think when you look at that, you'll have to decide what the
And
cost.
there is an
benefit
existing backflow meter on one of I bought my adjacent lot, and there's a backflow meter. Can I reuse that backflow meter, or do I have to get a new one?
Yeah, it's very likely you're going to have to get new on that.
And that's at about $1,000.
It's possible.
All righty. And so now you said the backflows. Have you not pulled all the meters off of the houses that don't have water? So how would when the main line breaks, backflows, it comes back from the pressure. If I don't have any, meter on my side of the house, how does it get past, your guys' lines? You know where my meter is you got to the main? I mean, I don't have anything hooked up my house. It's off. I don't even have a meter there. So how is that supposed to backdraft onto this and get contaminated?
Well, if you're using water on that side, and that's where it would be, is if you had a water service hooked up or were using water.
Second question is, what should I put in for pipes in my house? Nothing with plastic, because if you do accidentally have a backflow and it backflows into my house, I got to repipe my house. Again, if the plastic, if the benzene gets in there, is that a concern I should be looking at? Excuse me.
And
the last guy would ask a few questions.
All right, I can answer that. There's a lot of decisions that you're going to have to make based on the same information that we have about how you do things on your side of the meter.
Where do we get that information at, though?
The information we presented tonight about what we see, where we see the contamination, how we see the contamination. That information will be available on the website as well to review in detail. We're sharing everything we have so everyone can make. There's a lot of decisions. I realize everyone in here is having to make a lot of really tough decisions that involve a lot of finance decisions, a lot of technical decisions about what you're going to do with your properties and your houses and things like that. And I 100% empathize with where you are. We're going to share all the data that we have with you so you can make the best decision you can.
All right, we just haven't talked about piping the house. That's my question. Yeah. What I should do for that. So I'll let these other people talk because they're over there in a hurry to go home, apparently.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Sorry, several questions. You're talking about differences of, you guys are talking about differences between meters. I lived on a private lane. My house burnt to the ground. My neighbors didn't. So,
That's good.
thanks. Okay. So the 2 meters sit side by side. They're connected. So he had clean water, they tested it. What prevents it from the benzene coming from my property into his? Because they're literally connected side by side.
Yes, that's a concern. If
Yeah.
you lose pressure and
Well,
the
I
water
am-
moves from one side to the other,
Yeah.
that's a concern we talked about.
Yeah, I'm
Certainly.
concerned about my neighbors. I mean, they've got young kids and,
Now, if we went to test that particular type of location, it's a dual meter, where the meters
Yeah.
are right side by side and served by the same lateral,
Same.
apparently, is that what I'm
Yeah.
understanding? Then that lateral would be tested, not just, apparently your neighbor may be tested in their house or on their side of the meter.
well, they tested the house,
We would
but I mean.
test that lateral to see if it was contaminated or not, and then isolate the side with the burn lot, by removing the meter, or putting in, for the temporary water, a backflow preventer. That's why the temporary water, if you call to get temporary water, then a backflow preventer has to be installed on that system so that we try to keep contamination from moving from burn lots into uncontaminated lands.
And then the gentleman before me, he asked about laundry. There's no place to do laundry here in town.
Move on.
Anyway.
Sorry. Sorry, I'm part B.
Go ahead. We're gonna switch back and forth, all right? Go ahead.
I've heard about $250 million to fix all this. If those two agencies don't come through with the money, what is your backup plan? And to go back to the first question, how do you view the probability of getting that big amount of money from them?
So right now, we're doing everything. Our plan is built for funding. We are working hand in hand with FEMA and Cal OES. Every step we make sure that we're passing it through them to make sure that it meets their requirements for funding. So we are heavily reliant on them being in partnership with us through this recovery process. So without them, we can't do this recovery, but we have them as a guarantee that they're going to be partners with us through this. So every step we make, we're stepping with them.
Thank you.
Hi. So I'm the spouse of the gentleman before. Thank you. That was one of my concerns about PID. How are you making money and how are you supporting yourself so that we don't get, I guess, gouged later on once our town gets rebuilt. But one of my questions was when we decide to give you a call, because I'm ready to do that. Our house is burnt, but we have gone into certain areas and brought in some trees and some plants that's not near our ashes, but we want those to be saved. We want to water them. We're lucky we have a little aqueduct, spring aqueduct that comes through our area. Sorry. We have a spring that goes through our property, and so therefore we're like picking up buckets and watering our plants, but I would like to get that turned back on. So to do that, is that something we can do for irrigation? Because I heard you address that when you were talking about your list. So.
Yes, so there is a process, and it's called interim water supply.
Okay.
Contact Paradise Irrigation District, let them know that you want interim water supply at your
irrigation?
address for any purpose, irrigation, construction, whatever the purpose is. And then there is a backflow preventer will be installed at your location.
Is that something that I can pay a private person to do? Or do
no,
you have to do it?
No, it's going to be installed by PID to make
Has to
so
be
that
you.
we're, I guess, can ensure that it's being done by the standards that are set by PID. That's
Okay.
the plan
Well,
right now.
my son is a plumber in town, and so therefore, is that something he can do? He's been helping other people. But by your standards, I have to have yours done and not his, correct?
Yes. I mean, the policy that was enacted is that PID personnel install a backflow preventer and then provide service to the lot. Whatever you want to do
Okay.
on your side of that is up to you.
All right,
But-
so if I do that and you come out and you look at that, and it is by your standards, am I okay?
That's not how it's set up right now. It's that
Okay.
PID personnel, just for the price of labor and materials.
Sorry, I
install
was the
it.
defiant one, I gotta ask.
It's all right.
Thanks.
Yes, I'm Bob Carley. I have two questions. If the meters have been turned off at the burned structure sites, how can further contaminants enter the PID system? Why is there a concern if the meters are off? the contaminant would be between the house and the meter. If the meter has been turned off, how can further contaminants enter?
The concern is that the contamination entered the lateral. Sheila, can you drop it back to the slide that shows the anatomy of the distribution system? Maybe. So the concern is that, if you look at that slide, that contamination during the fire entered the service lateral and absorbed to the walls of the service lateral. And then when the system was refilled, even though the meter is closed, there's water in that lateral, and the contamination is desorbing from the walls of that pipe into the water that's in that lateral. That little 1.5 gallons or 5 gallons of water that's in that lateral, depending on the length. So that's the concern, and that if then you have a depressurization event and that water in that lateral gets pulled into the system, that it could cause some contamination. That's really the concern, and it is not a high likelihood, but it's possible, and we want to make sure that we're being cautious about returning people to potable service and being transparent about what that means and what the potential risks are.
Okay. Second question, why are you testing and sampling burnt structures before all standing structures are tested? It seemed like the focus should be on the standing structures so they know the quality while they're living in the house, or so they can reoccupy the house.
So absolutely. The data we have so far is the majority of it is from burnt structures. As we've progressed into implementing the recovery plan, the majority of the data is directed towards sampling standing structures. Oftentimes, we're getting a sample from an adjacent or 2 or 3 burned lots in an effort to get the hose over set up. So there is some of that data we're going to get from burned lots just because we're sampling for hose overs. But the initial data that was taken was generally taken from burned lots at the beginning. So this data, started back in December, with sampling and data being taken. And we're looking at all of the data to date. So yes, as we go forward, the majority of the data is, all of the efforts are directed towards sampling standing structures, and the data will start to favor that. So in the next time we all meet and I'm presenting more data and explaining whether things have continued along the same path or changed, then you'll see more standing structure data and a little bit more burned lot data.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I think our property is a little bit unique in that there are no laterals, and it's an old property, 1959, and the water main, it's a 4-inch main that runs down our right-of-way, 1/3 of a mile from Pence Road, and after the fire, they shut that valve off. And the end of December, I found the PID boots on the ground guy, turned my meter back on, opened that valve. The mobile home parks don't take that water. One has a well, and the other one, the main comes from Pence Road, 1/4 of a mile to the north. And my question is, what does altitude have to do with this situation? Because number one, that 4-inch water main goes 1/3 of a mile to our property, then it continues across our pasture and goes to June Way, which was developed later on, way after. And the house sits in the Nedry Spring drain. So there's spring water all around it. The meter sits right down next to the spring, next to the culvert bridge. It never even got hot. And I repaired my own water main, and I've been using that water ever since the end of December. And what's frustrating is, historically, we've been forgotten. PID didn't even know where we were. They didn't know where the shutoff valve was. I had to tell them it was on Pence Road. But my question is, with a cast iron water main that goes that far and water seeks its own level, if I can get the water tested and it tests good, why can't I just have that backflow thing put in and good to go? Because I've been using water since the end of December to irrigate and whatever. And the only thing I find in the water is a high amount of chlorine. And it's not killing anything. I've used it on my plants. I've used it, I don't feed it to my dogs. I use bottled water. My wife doesn't put it on her plants, but my citrus trees and everything else. And I've been blasting away ever since December. Now, I've been up here since January, and then I got kicked off a month later, and I've been behind this church in the parking lot for almost 4 months. I've got a builder in place. I'm being held hostage by this soil sample crap because they they lost our soil sample. It was taken, our debris was moved way back in February. So sometime this week, I'm going to get the green light and move back there because I've got the chief of OES working for me, Matt, and he answers to the commander himself. So my question is,
I think I got your question. I got your question. So there's a lot of people who are doing a lot of really good things on their side of the meter to satisfy themselves that they're protecting their house plumbing, the drinking water that they're drinking, and so forth. There's a variety of things going on. There's a lot of great things going on. From the perspective of the irrigation district, though, until we've tested your service and confirmed that the test that we took is indicating that there are no VOC there, we don't feel comfortable issuing a return to potability notice to a customer.
well, I understand that, but I'm also concerned that we're historically forgotten. And why is a cookie cutter neighborhood with all these laterals more important to us that are ready to rebuild? The debris's been gone now since February. That's a long time.
Understood. I mean, that's the best I can tell you.
That's all I got to say, and I'll stop by PID because I want some action. I want to get something done. And if I wasn't proactive, I wouldn't have water. The only reason I've got anything is because I've been proactive ever since December. And I've been up here since January. I never left. And I don't intend to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we had a question in regards to your backflow preventers. Putting them in at the house, we have our fire sprinklers going in on most of the new construction. It requires 1 inch. The backflow preventers then, depending on the distance, will have to be either 1 inch or bigger, depending on the meter to the house. And we were told that you're doing all of the backflows now. How long after that's done are we going to be able to use testing for the new construction without recontaminating the new stuff we've put in? We have to use something for water test, air test. We'd like to have water by the time we do drywall, so somebody accidentally puts a screw somewhere they shouldn't, we see it. Opposed to coming back and finding our gauge down 2 weeks later. Doesn't do us any good. I'd rather see the water coming out.
Yeah. Jim, you want, go ahead.
Well, I'd like to just address that a little bit and actually have Sammy follow up on it too. But I think that when we're able and we can see these new construction sites or existing buildings that are getting repaired or that we're putting new service connections to or putting water to, that we can work in potentially some sampling in there, and we have to work that into the plan.
Okay.
And then that would help us and help you determine, hey, what's my risk here associated with that?
Well, like they're building houses and they're getting their permits, they're going through them and we're knocking them out. They're getting done as quickly as possible because we want to get people here back in their homes. That's going to cause a delay if we can't get on it right away. So I'm kind of wanting to know what is going to be our time frame. Like, do I have to let you know, hey, you need to go out to this address, please, and check it? So by the time we get to that stage, we're not recontaminating a system that we just spent money and time putting
100%.
into these customers.
So when interim water is supplied, again, it's going to be supplied under the current water advisory, right? Mm-hmm. So if once you go to get the interim water to use for construction purposes, it's going to be supplied under the current water advisory, which means we do not know the potability of that water. Okay. I completely understand that there are people wanting to rebuild. There are people wanting to move back into temporary housing, mm-hmm. trailers and RVs and things like that for some period of time while they rebuild. There are people who want to connect to PID for the first time. And there are people who are in standing structures that want to be able to use their water. So what you're talking about really comes down to how are we prioritizing this work? There are we know somewhere around 1,400 standing structures There are somewhere in the nature of 30 to 50 building permits that have already been pulled. We know there are a lot more that will be pulled. And so we have this number of maybe somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 places that we need to try to serve potable water, and we can't do that,
Yeah,
right?
no, I understand
So the
that.
best thing that we can do is to attack the areas where we get the most done the quickest first, and work our way through the system. And we're doing this without bias. We're just doing it based on how can we get done with the most, the quickest. So some places, I don't know where the place you're talking about is.
We're all over.
It may be in, some of your locations that you're working may be in areas that we get to very soon, and some areas may be several months away. We're working to get through all of the testing in as short a time frame as possible. And I wanted to come up here tonight and say, we'll be able to have all of the standing structures and support 500 rebuilds by this date. I don't have that date yet,
Okay.
because we still need to get the contracting mechanisms in place to bring in labor force to do that, or if we continue to do it using mutual aid or PID staff, there's a certain pace we can achieve. We'd like to achieve a better pace. We understand the need. Until I have real schedules that I can truly commit to, and people can, because I know this is about rebuilds and people putting money into things and wanting to be able to use that. I don't want to, stand up here and just make up dates.
Yeah, well, we're checking in on some kind of filtration systems that we might be able to put in. Do you have any recommendations on your site that we might be able to look into?
So the protection of plumbing inside, on the customer side of the meter, is a discussion topic that is, I'm sure, on several people's mind in various ways, from protecting new plumbing to, reoccupy or continue to occupy a house and using the water. There are guidelines from the appropriate agencies that are forthcoming, is our understanding, as we start to return to potability. And hopefully those will help to shed some light on the appropriateness of those treatment systems. There are treatment system professionals out there who can help you look at water quality samples from those sites and decide what treatment system is appropriate for that site.
Do you have those names and stuff on your site for those people? So that we could actually have an idea for our customers?
Yeah, we don't have any recommendations at this point. We're not recommending one or the other, and the reliability of the system is based on the professional opinion of the person installing it.
Yeah, okay. And then the last one is fire sprinklers. Are they going to be making them mandatory for your houses that are still standing? I heard something about that, and I wasn't sure if that was...
That's a building official question, so that goes to the town.
Okay. I was just wondering, because of the backflow preventers, they're going to have to be all
Understood,
upgraded.
yeah,
So.
and potentially meter, line
Thank
size increase and so forth.
All right.
It's a good
We'll talk
question.
to you later.
You may have just answered most of my questions. I have a standing structure. We've put a filter in. It's a business we've been running since January, and we would like to know how to test our water in the building itself.
So we just were on a call today, and there are guidelines that are being developed by other agencies to hopefully help people make those decisions on how to test their houses and businesses on their side of the meter.
So you have
So hopefully they're
nothing yet.
forthcoming. I don't have anything from PID. We're just trying to get to the meter.
And lastly, do you have a schedule for where you are testing?
We do not. As we go to test an area, we will be communicating to the people in that area, but I don't think at this point there's any plan to publish a list of here's where we're going to go in the next several weeks, or here's our plan going forward. We will contact people and organize that.
Thank you.
At this point.
So I just have two questions. Last meeting you guys talked about tanks for standing homes, and I noticed that it wasn't brought up at all in this meeting, your guys' plan to move forward. We have 2 tanks we brought in on our property, one for our trailer. We plumbed one to our house, so when we eventually can move back in, it's ready. But you guys talked about putting together a water route, providing tanks. trucking water up? Because right now we truck water up at $210 every couple weeks. So it's not cheap.
So the initial plan was to isolate standing structures from the system using tanks. As we've looked at how we can recover the system to potability in the fastest way, we've moved towards the use of hose overs and testing, hose overs to isolate, testing, and return to potable service from the distribution system as quickly as possible. The best answer I have for you on being able to get a large tank that's not portable filled on your property is that as soon as we can, we will try to return your service to potable service and deliver potable water to your site. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that, but that at this point is the, for somebody who has purchased a tank and is using that tank, I think that's the answer we have right now. Is there any other add to that? Nope.
So my second question was, we talked about, you guys mentioned, we'll get our certificate for potability, we can start using our tank. If an incident happens and there's a possible contamination, we'll be notified. At that point, when they come out and retest for VOCs and other possible contaminations to our house, obviously we hope it's clear, but if it's not clear, what are the steps as homeowners are we to take now that we just contaminated all the pipes in our house that were not contaminated before?
That is an extremely valid concern. I think that each person is going to have to look at what they think the likelihood of that happening is. It's something that we haven't really come up with guidelines for or guidance for going forward. That is certainly a valid thing to be concerned about. And if an area under some circumstance was declared potable and then we had to declare it non-potable, what we would do to work with those homeowners to help return the entire area, both the area that was declared non-potable and retesting, all of the areas affected by that water or potentially affected by that water, hasn't been decided yet, but it certainly needs to be.
One more thing, sorry guys. When originally you guys were talking, you were moving from top down. Are you guys still moving in that same fashion? So us down in zone 10 will be last.
The prioritization is not necessarily top down at this point. It is more how can we test the most standing structures the fastest. It also has a little bit to do with the size of main that's serving those structures in terms of prioritization, but it is not currently top down.
Okay, thank you.
So I already know you don't have an answer to my question, but I want to bring this up for discussion because I've heard very little about it, and I think it needs to be brought out so that everybody starts talking about it. There are a lot of structures that were in this town, residences, before the town of Paradise existed. There are a lot of structures that are pre-existing non-conforming because they were not within service distance for fire hydrant in case of a fire. And our current building code has limitations on what you can build and how far away it's going to be, even with a sprinkler system. So the question I'm throwing out, and again, I know you don't have the answer, but I want to bring it up so that everybody starts talking about it, is simply, what is a homeowner going to do when they go to the town and say, here's my application for a permit to rebuild, and they say, great, we have to run this by PID because they have to look at it for fire protection, and PID is going to come back and say our recommendation is you have to enter into a pipeline agreement with PID and put in a 6 or an 8-inch main and a fire hydrant within a reasonable distance. And you're going to find probably hundreds of structures that were burned that are no longer pre-existing non-conforming. Now they're going to be new construction, and a lot of these individuals, their insurance may not cover it. They may not be able to finance it through the bank, and it may be the thing that keeps them from being able to rebuild. So I know that the town of Paradise has a fire hydrant, a fire fund that PID monitors, because I used to be on the board. And I'm not sure whose liability it is to make that happen, but I think what's somehow or another, we got to start talking about funding for adding these mains with these new hydrants that are not the wharf hydrants, that are actually legal hydrants, to some of these areas that need to be rebuilt before you get lots of people saying, what am I going to do now? I can't build my house because I can't afford a fire hydrant. Okay?
Yes.
Thank you.
That is a very significant issue that we need to look at, and there's a lot of them.
Got a couple questions, Sammy. One is the reverse flow valve, or that has to be installed on the property. Do I understand correctly that you're focusing primarily on new build right now?
So anyone who wants to get water to a burned lot needs to enter into a temporary or a interim water use agreement, and then a backflow preventer will be installed to that burned lot. Whether they use that for construction or irrigation or any other purpose, what happens on the other side of that backflow preventer is up to the homeowner or the business owner. But it's to serve places where the lot was destroyed. Standing structures are not required right now to install them.
That's good. And next is that I'm hearing conflicting information. Obviously, you reported up here that PID had to install that, the valve or whatever.
Backflow preventer, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm hearing a lot of people say they're going to install their own, or they're having professionals install that. What's the honest to God answer to this? Does PID have to install this, or can a professional do it?
Yes, PID needs to exercise control over that. So we're building the entire assembly pre-made, and it connects directly to the angle stop, so there's no valving. There are other benefits that we're trying to make sure that our customers reap from that as well. So if we look at that and we say it's an interim water supply, our intent is that we're very confident, well, we know in rebuilds that there's going to be a backflow preventer required. And when we draw our new standard up, we have some ideas of what that looks like. We don't have it set in stone yet, but we're proposing that the backflow preventer come first from the service connection, then the meter comes. So PID would own that, and we want to be consistent with the type of device we use and the sizes. And the other side that we're looking at too is if you do have this as an interim water supply on a destroyed parcel, if it does become contaminated when we come to test that service line, then that's something that we can deal with as a district and correct that, and that is not a cost to the owner at that, or the parcel property owner at that time.
Good. One other, we had talked a while back about contaminants from the meter through the house, through with the plumbing, and one of the suggestions that, or one of the topics that came up was replacing the plumbing in your house if you're concerned that your plumbing is contaminated and you don't feel you can get it cleaned out. Now, if you've got copper and galvanized in the house, do you still have to worry about the contaminants with backflushing? Or is it really the best thing to do is replace as much of the plumbing as you can?
Again, guidelines are supposed to be forthcoming on those kinds of questions. That's exactly the research that they do at Purdue, is looking at different materials and absorption rates of VOCs and so forth, but we're remaining focused on the recovery of the PID system up to the meter.
Right. I was just asking about materials within the house.
I understand.
Yeah. So.
I understand the question.
No answer.
I don't have an answer for you.
Okay. Yeah, my insurance, like we talked about, needs to have something in writing for me to be able to replace my plumbing. So
Understood.
That's what I think. Okay, thank you.
That's one of the questions I was going to ask. You're concerned on the burnt lots from the main to the meter. That's what you're testing to see if it's contaminated.
And the standing structures also, from the main to the meter, and the mains.
On the burnt lot, you're just going to the meter.
Correct.
Okay, so my house was built in 1935. It was burnt down. I have all steel pipes through the whole property. So I shouldn't be concerned if the lateral is not contaminated, then my steel pipe should be fine, right? No. No?
Again, the information about what to do on the customer side of the meter is coming from other agencies besides PID. PID's responsibility is up to the meter. So those are great questions. There's a lot of discussion and information being knocked about, but this is
Are you saying
not the
that,
forum where it's being discussed.
that the lateral could be contaminated and then not be contaminated? I mean, if it's contaminated, right?
The service lateral from
Yeah.
the main to the meter, or you're talking about the customer
From the main to the
line?
meter.
From the main to the meter, we'll test that and determine whether it's contaminated or not,
Okay.
and communicate that
And
to
if
the
that's clear,
property
then we
owner.
can move forward.
Yep.
Good enough. Thank you.
Couple of thoughts for you. I do need to know, where's there a list of properties and hydrants that, burned properties and hydrants that have been tested?
So that information is available through the GIS, Geographic Information System, that's on the PID website under the Recovery
So
tab.
It says what properties have been tested and what fire hydrants.
If you follow that to an area and you click on the icon, it'll tell you what the address was and what the results were for that test.
Okay. If it hasn't been tested, how do I get it tested? We're living on a burnt property that we purchased.
Yeah.
And no meters. There's a fire hydrant.
So again, this is a question about priority, and as we go through the system, how we prioritize testing. And I talked about standing structures, temporary housing, which is what you're talking about, rebuilds, and temporary housing, rebuilds, and new customers that are entering the system. So we're going to get through them all as quickly as possible, but we are prioritizing it based on trying to get as many done as early as possible. So where you end up on that priority list is
Shouldn't you
based on that.
prioritize it by the people that are actually living up here? I don't get that, because we're temporary. I was told we were not going to be provided with a water tank as you're providing standing homes with, which is wrong. I've been a PID customer for 10 years. We had to find
So-
our own tanks. We're having our own potable water brought in. I mean,
We are trying to collect as much data as we can on which standing structures are occupied. There have been some surveys. There's been requests for people to share information about whether they're occupying structures or not. And when we go to test an area, we are trying to contact those customers to find out if they're in their structures or not.
but there
It's-
are other people living up here that have been here for years. They're on a property that has a burned structure, and you're not helping them.
So completely understood, and there's no difference in the way that the priority of testing is being handled between those different categories that I talked about. Standing structures, occupied lots.
I get those, but what I'm asking is, why are you not helping with water tanks for the people that are living here in temporary housing with no home, burned property? Why are you not providing them with holding tanks for potable water, like you are for standing structures?
So there haven't been any water tanks provided by PID to anyone. That was in the original plan, that was an idea on isolating people from the distribution system. But since then, as I talked about tonight, the plan has been revised and changed over time, but PID isn't providing tanks to certain people and not to others right now. There haven't been any tanks provided to anybody. We're trying to test the system and return the system, the distribution system, to potability as quickly as possible.
Okay.
So to just build on that, if you're seeing tanks at residences, at businesses, those were purchased by the owners of those homes and those businesses.
Okay. Another question. Why is it our responsibility to pay for these backflow meters if we decide we want water on our property? If you're saying that you want priority say over what goes on with them, then we shouldn't have to pay for them. Otherwise, we should be able to get a professional to install it. Do you see what I'm saying?
No.
Because I'm looking at your charts up here, your little slides, and it's saying it's going to cost each one of us, if we decide we want irrigation water, Because I have walnut trees, I have olive trees, I have fruit trees. I'm not watering with this water coming through the pipes. I'm not gonna take the chance, not at getting in my fruits, in my vegetables, nothing. If I request a backflow meter be put on so I can irrigate and have healthy foods and a healthy piece of property, why do I have to pay for that if you guys are gonna have the ultimate say over what happens with it? It's a very good point. You've got $250 million that you're trying to get funded, and you should be spending that money on retaining your clients, because at this point, I'm using external water tanks for 2 trailers. I have a grandson, I have a son, I have a daughter-in-law, I have my husband, and I have all my animals on this property. And I'm not feeding any of them or the trailers anything but potable water. Nothing, it's not safe. So I just want to know what you guys are thinking. Why should we have to pay for that? I don't think we should have to pay for a backflow device.
So I'm going to take a stab at this, see how it goes.
Okay, you go for it, dude.
All right. As a district, as a utility, as a community, right, we're faced with this mass destruction of the community and mass contamination of the utility. In order to repair that, it's going to take a long time.
I get that.
That's where we're starting from.
All of us do.
That's
sure
free.
We all do.
That's at no charge to the customer. We're going to go as fast as we can to return the system to potability, to support standing structures, move-backs, temporary housing, rebuilds, new customers, all of the people that want to live in paradise. We are going to go as fast as we possibly can to get there at no charge to the customer. If you want to get water faster than that, faster than we can do that, which the fastest we can go with the level of destruction to the system, the level of destruction to the community, the level of destruction to the utility, the fastest we can go may not be fast enough for you for what you want to do. What each individual has different things going on their properties they want to accomplish. If you need to get water faster than we can do that, that's why we're asking those customers to pay for that backflow preventer to provide water to their property. That is the best explanation I've got for you for that.
It's not a very good one, but I guess.
That's enough.
The other thing, I was asked by the person, the company that we're having truck our water in, to just lay this on the table for you guys. It would be really cool and very helpful to your customers if you guys would put a station up here somewhere where, even if it's at the McGalley station, the PID station up there, where these big water trucks can fill up without filling up in Chico and us having to pay for their trip up the hill. It gets very expensive.
It does. So, and I should be receiving a correspondence back from, we put out a request for quote for that service, and we need to get that information back from contractors and analyze that, see what that looks like, and then see if we can put that into play. Okay. So we definitely have been looking into that, and I want to back up just real quick to your backflow question, and I hear your concerns. We do want to take care of our customers. We really do. And in the interim water supply, when we look at that, part of that is we wanted to get water to all of our customers, not just those in standing structures. At first, the priority was standing structures. Right. It was like, we knew there's going to be construction, there's going to be, it's going to dry out very, very quick. People are planting gardens. There's fruit trees already well established here, so we know and understand the need for water. So we were trying to balance out. We have to still protect the public drinking water system, and we do that through backflow protection, because now at these destroyed parcels, there are increased hazards, especially where now we have different types of water systems on that parcel that have pumps and different types of potential cross connections that could easily contaminate the public drinking water system, right? So the increased hazards were there. So the intent was to protect the customers from that kind of action, right? So then when we look at cost, we say that PID is a public utility. We can only charge labor, equipment, material, and overhead. So we go out to quote, we get some pretty good prices, and that pass that cost directly on to you. What I would like to say in that is somewhere along the line, we have to have a standard of installation, and we have to have certain control over that, and the backflows have to be tested for functionality once they're installed before we put water through them. I think what I'd like to say to you to better answer your question is that as a group, we can talk about the potential if we can see a private contractor perhaps meet our standard and work with PID to make that happen, utilizing the same device, that perhaps we can try to exercise that option for you. We need to really talk about that and see if we can't have that standard met. Of course, we have a board of directors that's going to have to make the final decision, but certainly we want to address all those issues that pertain to our customers.
Okay.
Okay?
That's a much better answer.
Okay.
That's a much better answer.
Okay.
Okay, the other thing was just information. The Hope Center, and I'm surprised you did not share this information. The Hope Center provides water for 5 gallons, 1 gallon cases of drinking water at no charge to anyone.
Okay. Yep.
So that's out there. There is somebody real close. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
First of all, I want to thank you all for being here and listening to us. My place burned down, my wife and I. We have almost an acre, and I'm kind of an optimist. I'm betting the water line's going to be all right, the way you've been going through it. But from the water line on out, my meter's burnt to a crisp. So I'm sure those lines are burnt. So I'm thinking they probably have to replace the lines from there to there. Now, I don't know if you do that after you take the testing or before. We're planning on moving up there before, we've got a home being brought out, a manufactured home coming out. We've signed escrow. We're waiting on the cleanup, which I haven't got yet. Once we get that, I'm gonna bring my children, my son-in-law and his trailer, and my wife and I in our motorhome, and we plan on staying there until the place is built. But we'll have to have water. Now, we can get by with non-potable water because we don't have to drink it, but that's not going to bother anything. So therefore, I would be more than glad to pay the money, the redo money. A friend of mine put a $4,000 tank in. I can't afford that water tank, but he's got money. It's okay if you got money. You can just you can clean your lot for $35,000. We're taking him for $6,000. My point is, are we going to be able to? How long would it take us once the lot's cleaned to get a hold of you guys, pay whatever I have to pay, which I will gladly, to get the water to us?
For a temporary water supply?
Yes.
So for interim water supply, it's going to vary depending on where you are and what's going on with the district. So if you put in the request, the district will communicate with you and let you know along the way how things are going and when it's going to be done. But I don't have a.
The sooner the better. I can do it anytime I want.
What's that?
Can I do it anytime I go down there? I have to go down in person and tell.
Or call.
Huh?
Or call.
And then I can pay the money right then for the backflow?
Correct.
Yes. And then things will happen?
Correct.
Yes. That's all I want. Thank you.
All right. Yes. So, you know how at the end of some movies there's a post-credit scene and you're like, my butt's falling asleep, but I want to hang out for the post-credit scene? We have a little post-credit scene, so we're going to go 5 more questions and then we'll do that, so hang in.
Thank you. Being the last one in the line, a lot of my questions are already answered. The one question that isn't answered
is right behind you.
was the one about backflows. I went into the PID office about 3 weeks ago and told them I wanted to turn water on at a site where I'm going to rebuild. I had to do a septic tank test, and they said, you have to install a backflow preventer first. I said, okay, fine, that's not a problem. So I went out, and I have 4 properties I'm rebuilding. I bought 4 backflow preventers, the same one that you have on your little installation sheet. And I thought I understood somebody to say tonight, in fact it was you, that said that you folks have to install them and you want to be in control. They're on my side, the meter.
So right now it's an interim water supply and we don't have a meter, so the backflow would actually be connected directly to the angle stop. And I would just, so that we're clear about what we're talking about, you came in 3 weeks ago and it was at the last board meeting that we had this approved, so it was just on Friday that it was approved, and we started doing this service on Monday.
Okay.
So it's only a week
Now, I
old.
still want to install my own meter. Or
I think-
backflow, my own backflow, I'm sorry.
I think that a specific question like that is probably better handled after or
They
another day.
have, their installation sheet says Wilkins number so-and-so. That's what we got. And that's the
And-
same.
And we do have we do have a standard installation for a meter service connection. The interim water supply looks considerably different than that. And that's one of the last customer that was up here that I addressed. We need to talk about that and see what that looks like. We would look at the standard for the interim water supply. We would have to meet that. And it doesn't look, it's the same device. It just doesn't look like the drawing that you're seeing with the unions and going down in. It's a different assembly.
And it has to be within 12 inches of the meter.
We still, well, and we connect that directly to the angle stop. So there wouldn't be a meter there. There would be no valving there. It would go straight to our angle stop.
It's on my side, the meter. That's what your standard has. I just spent,
Add a permanent service connection.
I just spent a bundle of money and bought 4 meters or backflows so I'd have them for all my properties, because we're working on trying to rebuild this town.
Sure.
And now you're changing the plans and the requirements after you hand out the information and say that I have to do that?
So I want to, hold on just a second. Hold on a second. What I'd like to just say is that there's sort of a us versus you thing that you're feeling, and I appreciate that. I don't think it needs to be that way. I'd like to sit down and talk with you about where you're at, what you've purchased, how that can fit into our plan, and work with you on getting it solved. And we would work with anybody on that.
Yeah.
So I don't want people to feel like PID needs to be in control and PID is going to do this and that. We're making decisions in the best way that we can to provide clean water to everybody and protect the public water supply. If some of those decisions have been unclear, or there have been unclear information has come out and people have made decisions like you and gone out and purchased backflow devices and constructed backflow preventer systems, on a case-by-case basis, we're going to work with you to sort out how to get you whole.
And we have done that.
Okay, and we've done it. We'll do it again. So come talk to us.
I don't need to spend $2,000 to install 4 meter or backflows when I know how to do it myself. I installed the one on my home, which was required when I built the home in 2006.
And what Sammy is saying, and you had already done that before we looked at the interim water supply. And so what Sammy is saying is, let's sit down and talk. You and I can sit down and talk, and we'll come up with a solution that utilizes your backflow devices, a Wilkins 975 XL2, just like you said was on our standard. So let's talk about that, and we'll get that worked out together.
And how soon can we get that done? I've got action going right now.
Perfect. Come into my office tomorrow, or we'll talk. Leave your number. We'll get it down, and we'll talk.
Be glad to give you my number. The other question I have was, what were the VOC numbers prior to the fire? Is that information available to us?
So,
I mean, our VOC numbers, we had all non-detects for the VOCs that are regulated. So it's below the detection limit. And since we had non-detects, our sampling schedule was, I think it's 3 years between samples.
It's all been non-detect on,
Yeah.
on everything?
Well, there are a couple VOCs that do pop a detect, and that's chloroform and dichlorobromomethane. They're disinfection byproducts. We sample those quarterly. But other than that, no, it's non-detect.
Okay. Maybe I can see that report when I come into your office.
You won't have those reports.
Yeah, those have been in every consumer confidence report that's been produced over the years.
We have CCNRs on the website.
They're on our website.
Yeah, they're on the website.
We have CCNRs there you can look at.
Okay. Lady over here had a question about our filtration system that she installed, wants to know where to get it tested. I put in one from Culligan, and they do the testing, and they charge like $150 to do a test. And by the way, it's clean, and that's good.
Good information.
That's all I have. Thanks. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Getting back to the backflow preventers, we go to the interim ones, you're gonna charge us, when we upgrade our system to rebuild the house, and we gotta go to a bigger backflow preventers and everything else, because our line sets are gonna change. Are we gonna have to pay again, or are you gonna take those smaller ones back? What are we gonna?
I don't have an answer to that. I can tell you that part of our discussions in terms of funding for this involve that very question. And we're talking to FEMA and Cal OES about how this is going to be funded in the long run. That exact issue is a big issue.
My house has a 3/4 inch service, and the fire hydrants or sprinkler systems are gonna want inch and a quarter.
Certainly.
To support, you know.
It's an outstanding question, and we are working to have an outstanding answer. I don't have one right now.
Another question I have is, what happened to all the backflow preventers we had? I mean, do they all melt and do no good? Because I had backflow preventers I had to pay, you guys required me to pay an inspection fee on every year. Did they all fail in the whole city?
Well, we haven't tested them all, of course, but at standing structures, we have found those, many of them fail the test. Many of them are clearly destroyed. The test cocks and everything, the valves are clearly physically damaged. If they appear to be intact, we're finding that the internal check valves typically fail, won't hold.
Yeah, what good are they?
Well,
Are we going to put them underground now to
right.
try to protect them, or?
So that's right. So when we look at a new standard and see what that looks like, we have to address those particular issues.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
How you guys doing? Listen, first off, I want to say thank you to all you guys. I have a good idea of what you're going through. I moved up here November 1st, and I was a commissioner in San Jose, so I know what it's like to deal with FEMA and OES, and I appreciate all you guys for what you're doing. I have two questions. I'm a zone captain in Zone 4, and as you guys know, we have the most standing houses. One question I'm getting from a few of my neighbors is that on one of the bills when we were gone, it says we all used 20,000 gallons, and I'm like, I didn't use 20,000 gallons because I wasn't here. But that's just one question I got from somebody, and then I looked at my own and I said, gee whiz, I got the same thing. The other thing is, right at the end of Valley View where it goes to Crestmore, there's a fire hydrant there where everybody fills up their tanks for all the debris removal. Yes. Is it going to cause a problem that sometimes those guys leave that open, and will it backflow into the system where most of our houses are?
So the meter, construction meters are set up with a reduced pressure.
This isn't a construction meter. This would be one of the fire hydrants.
They're just directly to a hydrant?
Yeah, that's where they refill all these trucks.
Then I need to look at that because we have 19 designated sites with meters and backflow preventers on them for construction water use.
This would be at Crestmore and right around Rankin. You'll see the water because the street's usually wet there.
Thank you.
Thank you again for what you guys are doing.
Hi. Several things have come up for me. I am the only one I've heard here who had two structures on their property. My house burned 30 feet away. My garage with an apartment over it is standing. So the meter's gone. I have a plumber, contracting plumber who is right now trenched for gas. It was tested today and held, and water. He's kind of stuck now. He and I both were in your office 2 weeks ago, picked up the picture showing how to build the backflow. He went and got all the parts, and now we can't use those parts. I'm not interim.
Well, you actually, I think you are a little bit interim because you do have a destroyed parcel on your lot.
Yeah,
So,
one of each.
But I suspect that I'm going to get a few calls tomorrow, and that's okay because that's what I'm there for. So we can address that. So the house is standing?
There's a garage with an apartment above it that's standing.
Yeah.
We have a new electrical service. The gas pipes were put in, and the pressure test was done today.
Yeah.
They're supposed to set the gas meter next week.
That's one of those cases that's a special case, and we need to talk, and I want to talk to you about that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh,
So
also,
to make sure I get your contact information.
Thank you,
please.
yes. And one other thing, this is a pitch. My nephew is in Chico right now. He was born and raised in Orville. He is a groundwater contamination expert. He works all over the world. He speaks before Congress as an expert to groundwater contamination. He helped develop and clean Livermore Lab. He's got an amazing expertise, and he said, "You tell him I'll help them fix my auntie's water."
All right, last one.
I'll try to be quick. I just wanted to get clarification on a couple of things you mentioned. You said they're going to be testing, or there's going to be information about like pipes and VOCs and absorption rates. Okay, if that's not under your purview, where would we find that information when it's available?
As soon as it's available, I think we will tell everybody where to find it. There are several different agencies looking at releasing that. As soon as it's available, there'll be a communication from PID telling everybody, here's where you can find that. There'll likely be links from PID's website to that information and so forth.
Okay. And you said we'd be notified if there was a contamination event, depressurization, something. How quickly would we know? Would it be hours or days? Would we be using contaminated water for a little while and not know it? Or?
So it'd be using the same approach that has been taken with main breaks and potential bacterial contamination for a long time, which is as quickly as possible, and it is generally quite quickly.
Okay. And this last thing may have been addressed. I got here a little bit late, but you said something about working to correct all this as fast as possible and no charge to the customer. Well, I'm still getting charged $21 and some change a month. Where is that going? If not to a backflow preventer, if that's a separate charge, where's my monthly bill going? I'm certainly not seeing water from it, so.
We still have a whole system to maintain. We have 2 reservoirs that we're maintaining. There's a certain cost associated with maintaining the system, even though there isn't potable water in the system. So we still have quite a few. There's customer service. There's things that are normal operations that are not being reimbursed through FEMA or OES that we continue to have to pay for. This is a good yeah. But we are looking to the state to help us with some of the back funding for those operations to keep PID solvent through this recovery process. The governor has put some money into his budget, and we're asking for a little bit more. So continue to support PID through the process of this next budget cycle to help us kind of stay solvent through there so that we are available through this recovery process and that there isn't this huge amount of money that we're looking for our small amount of customers at the end of the day to keep PID running.
Thank you.
You can also donate to help them. I did.
Okay, well, I want to thank all that stayed for the, for what would you call it, the credits? Yeah, so just like there's the first building permit that's issued in the town, There's the first service that we feel we've tested. We've looked at it from a professional engineering side, professional water side, and we feel like that service passes all of the tests associated with potability. And we kind of wanted to present it here at our the town meeting tonight. And so the letter reads, congratulations, this letter is to certify the water at your property address, 1464 Forest Service Road, is deemed potable in accordance with Paradise Irrigation and the California State Drinking Water Standards. This is a letter to Fire Station 35, and I believe there might be a representative here. I don't know if there is. Maybe not anymore. They didn't stay through the meeting. But this is the letter that we're going to be sending out to to the customers as we are able to get water back in service. And it's like eating an elephant one bite at a time, and we've just taken our first bite out of this. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for all your questions. And we're going to continue informing you. So this is not the last meeting. We are looking to do another one of these in about 7 weeks to inform you about the further testing of what's gone on and the information with the system. Thank you.
Could you do your meetings on a different night than the town council?
Yeah, sorry about that. We didn't realize that we had done that. We did this out in front.